What were you up to 6 years ago? It's a while back, so don't feel bad if you can't remember. Me? Well, I was settling into life in the US, having literally just stepped off an airplane from the UK just a few days earlier. And aside from dealing with the usual stresses and strains of moving a third of the way around the world and dealing with a life without furniture, because that was still en route via the Panama Canal, I remember hearing rumblings about Volkswagen cars and tailpipe emissions. These rumblings quickly turned into one of the largest automotive scandals of recent years and laid bare a spider's web of deceit, complicity, and purposeful cheating by Volkswagen executives and lead engineers. The subject of the scandal? Certain model year diesel-engined cars made by the Volkswagen Group, which, by the way, included other brands within the Volkswagen family. Those cars and their engines, marketed by Volkswagen as so-called clean diesel, had an engine management chip within them that contained a subroutine which allowed the car to detect if it was strapped to a dynamometer or rolling road in a laboratory or at a test centre. If the car thought that was true, it would change its engine management parameters to ensure its exhaust gases met the required nitrogen oxide targets in whichever country it was in, at the sacrifice of a little bit of power at the wheels. If it didn't detect it was on a test rig, the engine management system set itself up to produce many, many times the legal limits for NOx, producing more power at the wheels in the process. Volkswagen faced criminal proceedings in multiple countries across multiple continents. Individual executives, engineers, and suppliers also faced prosecution, and the company's reputation hit rock bottom. And while many other mainstream automakers were later found to be cheating in similar ways for their own emissions tests, including BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, Stellantis, and Renault, to name just a few, with some using similar cheat devices to Volkswagen and others just intentionally misrepresenting real-world emissions to government agencies, it was Volkswagen that took the brunt of the scandal. To date, the company has faced more than 31 billion euro of fines, which is nearly 37 billion US dollars, and it has recalled more than 9 million cars globally. It has been forced to go through a total rebranding. No, not to Volkswagen, and no, not the first time in its history either. And the damage to customers' trust has lost it a lot of customers forever. All of that, you could quite easily argue, is how it should have been. But Dieselgate has also been a major driver towards getting people behind the wheel of an electric vehicle. And as I'm about to detail, it could actually have helped make electric vehicles more appealing to non-early adopters. First, of course, there was that immediate backlash against diesel. Up to the point that the Dieselgate debacle occurred, people often emphasised the perceived benefits of diesel engine technology over electric vehicles. People often chose a diesel vehicle because it offered better gas mileage and was greener for the planet, even though there are a whole host of reasons as to why that wasn't actually the case that I am not going to go into today. Gotta love advertising, eh? And those who really wanted to go one step further chose to run their diesel-engined cars on biofuels like reused vegetable oil, which, of course, owners could claim was carbon neutral, or at least less carbon intensive. The big shock that came in September 2015 was that no, none of that was true, and so people who had previously opted for diesel as their preferred fuel started to look elsewhere. Many of those customers started to look at the alternatives, of which electric was one, and because Tesla was, by that point, full steam ahead with its Model S and Model X, and cars like the Nissan Leaf were readily available nationwide, many people who went into the Dieselgate debacle with a diesel vehicle ended up switching to an electric one, or at least a plug-in hybrid, because they didn't want to be associated with a diesel vehicle anymore. And that is, of course, long before you even start to talk about those Volkswagen customers whose cars were repurchased as part of the Dieselgate settlement. While not everyone who previously owned a clean diesel vehicle agreed to have their vehicle repurchased, the majority of the 9 million people who owned an affected diesel Volkswagen opted to have their car brought back. And that, of course, meant that there were many, many new people looking for a new car who otherwise would not have been. And just as there were many people who decided to ditch their diesel car, even if it wasn't part of the recall, some of those who found themselves in need of a new vehicle found themselves looking towards electric and plug-in hybrid. How many people actually made the switch from a diesel vehicle to an electric one as a result of Dieselgate? It's hard to put a figure on the number, but I've got to say, over the last 6 years, I have met significant numbers of people and fans of this channel who found themselves behind the wheel of an electric vehicle after selling their Dieselgate car back to Volkswagen. But the biggest impact on electric vehicles was the court-mandated settlements in various countries around the world that required Volkswagen to fund electric vehicle infrastructure. It was effectively a court-mandated cash injection into electric vehicle charging infrastructure that was both reliable and charging standard agnostic. And the money ploughed into Electrify America in the US, Electrify Canada in Canada, and the Ionity network in Europe has helped dramatically expand electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And yes, while each network was technically separate and distinct from Volkswagen, each network quickly set up preferential agreements with Volkswagen that had shareholding in those companies to help it lay out comprehensive infrastructure for its then promised range of next-generation electric vehicles. Vehicles it started to promote almost as soon as the dust started to settle from Dieselgate. Isn't it funny how a company can rebrand itself so very quickly when its very future rests on it, huh? If you don't believe me regarding all of this, let's take a look back in the history books to see what charging networks were really like way back in 2015. Frankly, back then, if you wanted to make a long-distance cross-country road trip in an electric car in the US or Canada, your only real practical choice was to buy a Tesla and to make use of the Tesla supercharger network. Sure, there were corridors across both countries of standard agnostic charging stations, especially along the East Coast and West Coast, but they were far from comprehensive or reliable. The earliest charging networks that weren't Tesla-specific made use of the CHAdeMO DC quick charging standards. Most networks installed just one charging station at each location, and if you were really lucky, they also had a low-power AC charging unit. This meant that even if the high-power DC rapid charging station was broken, which was all too common an occurrence, you could at least charge, albeit for 3 or 4 hours, at the AC charging station to get you out of a muddle or to your next appointment very, very late. And as for CCS charging stations back then, while there were some brand new 50 kilowatt charging stations along major routes, a lot of the DC rapid charging stations for cars like the Chevrolet Bolt EV and BMW i3 were far slower. For example, when I first purchased my Chevrolet Bolt EV in 2017, I had to regularly take a road trip from Portland, Oregon to Medford, Oregon to see a family member who was in a long-term care facility down there. But it took forever to drive. That's because there was only one 50 kilowatt capable rapid charging station on the route, and it was pretty close to Portland. Every other rapid charging station maxed out at around 25 kilowatts. And I really don't need to tell you how much longer that took us to charge. In the US, Electrify America, paid for by that Volkswagen Dieselgate settlement, set itself up with a goal of installing redundant charging stations at each of its locations. It also preemptively installed higher power units than they were actually required at the time. And instead of arriving at a charging site with just one charging station and a pretty high probability that something would either be broken, leaving you completely stranded, or requiring you to faff around for a very long time to try and get it working, the new Electrify America locations had at least 4 charging units. Granted, only one of those would be compatible with CHAdeMO vehicles, but for those with CCS-compatible cars, Electrify America's expansion provided welcome and much-needed redundancy. Moreover, unlike most networks before it, which required you to have a membership to the network and carry around a funky RFID fob or card, Electrify America offered credit card readers at its charging stations. And while they didn't often work in those early days, I certainly had some interesting experiences with them, it made it substantially easier for someone who was just casually borrowing an EV to recharge it on the go. And yes, I am more than aware that Electrify America was and is far from perfect, and it's had its fair share of controversy, from overcharging customers and constantly disconnecting vehicles to failing to properly initiate charging on certain makes and models of EVs. Those early days of the network were, frankly, quite Wild West. But compared to what went before in many parts of the US and Canada, it was a massive improvement. It might have been a very pale imitation of the supercharger network to travel from coast to coast, but it finally made such trips possible for the first time without requiring 1,000,001 RFID cards and 6 different smartphone apps. And because EA was funded through Volkswagen's fines for cheating, the network was able to expand its locations and thus its coverage far more rapidly than many other networks out there. It wasn't starting from ground zero as most charging networks were, which required significant extra funding to just get them off the ground. It was starting with a big old pot of cash and a court-mandated reason to build out charging networks that everyone could use. And yes, that kind of made it an unfair monopoly. But frankly, if I'm making a road trip in an EV today that isn't a Tesla, I do my best to use Electrify America networks because, unlike some charging networks out there, there is at least a decent support line with trained staff who do seem to know what they're doing. And while, yes, I've still had some bad experiences in the past, in recent years, I've never failed to get a charge at a location I've stopped at, save for that one time earlier this year that I arrived at an EA site that was being rebuilt and was offline, but that one was totally my fault, not Electrify America's. Improved redundancy and reduced wait times to charge has really improved the electric vehicle ownership experience, and I suspect that has also played a part in helping people get behind the wheel of an EV, even if it wasn't a Volkswagen. Electrify America's charging stations are located at shopping malls and at big box, well-known stores, and that means people see them. And it reinforces the idea that, subconsciously, even though most of us who own an EV know that you don't need to use a rapid charging station all the time, especially if you have access to charging at home, it reinforces to the general population that EV charging is available and easy for you to use. Finally, through its court penance of Electrify America, Electrify Canada and Ionity, Volkswagen was essentially handed a get-out-of-jail card when it came to ensuring its upcoming electric vehicles had a reliable, robust charging network to use. Instead of having to build out the network as Tesla did, Volkswagen-friendly charging networks are already well established when the first ID.3 rolled off the production line in Europe, and the same has been true of the ID.4 in the US. Porsche already had a charging network already and capable of providing the 270 kilowatts its Taycan could drink up long before the car launched in 2020. And other automakers, even ones not directly involved in Dieselgate, have jumped on board with EA partnerships because of its rapidly expanding coverage. Many people look at the Dieselgate debacle and complain, quite rightly, about how Volkswagen behaved. Many, like those who have yet to forgive General Motors for crushing the EV1, have sworn off Volkswagen forever about the immense amount of pollution, death, and destruction those cheating Dieselgate vehicles were responsible for. And many see Volkswagen's court-mandated penance as little more than a metaphorical pat on the head and a stern talking to. After all, Volkswagen has, and will continue to, benefit from the charging networks it was forced to establish. It's a major shareholder in all of them. It did get off really lightly. But while we could make a whole video about the shady ethics that those court decisions betrayed, and how corrupt and self-protectionist these types of cases can be, at least we have something that for now has benefited every EV fan in the long term. And for that, I think we can be grateful. It hasn't made up for Volkswagen's wrongdoing in any way, shape or form, but at least it means people can feel confident getting behind the wheel of an EV. That's it for today. If you like the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and our other two channels, Transport Evolved Take 2 and Transport Evolved Shorts. I know that while a fair few of you are already subscribed, most of you who watch aren't, We know because we can see the analytics. So go on, hit the subscribe bell and hit the bell to help us out. Let us know below what you thought of this video, and if you're not someone who likes YouTube comments, then take this over to our Discord server. It is completely free, and we will leave the link for you to join below. Thanks on behalf of the entire Transport Evolved crew go out to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons. That's David Janakula, Andrew Martin, Guido Drahoa, Brophy Wolf, Tesla in the Gong, Paul Conway, Sean Ueda, Gordon C, Regine Fellows, Anonymous Freak, Jim Burness, Carl Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Laura Sanborn, Rory Litwin, and Denny Hyde. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters: John Lyons, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Will Graylin, Ellery Hannesley, and Ian. If you'd like to join the ranks of our wonderful supporters, you will find links below to Patreon, Bitcoin, and Ko-fi. And of course, you can buy your very own TE swag like this at our Redbubble store. Keep your eyes peeled because we've got some exciting new video distribution coming very soon with a pretty well-known network. But until then, thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!